Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and so, kind of amazing how many things can change worldwide in just a week, eh? Well, I still listen to a lot of music, and I actually had a pretty busy week here, so let's hold on and get on the pulse. So, we got 8 albums in the docket this week, but let's start off with something older from Real Estate, The Main Thing. I'm not going to dance around this. Remember a month or so back when I covered Bombay Bicycle Club and said a lot of critics gave lukewarm passes to milquetoast and increasingly anonymous indie rock in the 2010s? Yeah, if you want the poster child of that, we've got Real Estate. A thoroughly inoffensive and pleasant set of jangling guitars and winsome vocals that didn't have the grooves for a solid vibe or sharp enough writing to break free of their vague white boy existential ennui. And the white boy critics adored them until about 2017, when it seemed like everybody woke up to realize, wait a second, what has Real Estate really done besides steadily clean up their production and scrub away even more assets of their personality? Now, if you can't tell, I'm not really a fan. Days and Atlas were fine enough as background music, but I would never seek them out. So now we got an album, post all the critical hype, and it's a Real Estate album. So you got a lot of clean, jangling guitar lines, hazy and occasionally oily synth touches, some decent-ish grooves, and some of the most uninvolving vocals and songwriting you get in indie rock these days. That's probably the most consistent issue with Real Estate. Martin Courtney's vocals and presence is layered in a way to be so utterly unengaging, with lyrics so stripped of unique and explicit detail that any of the ennui at times passage and uncertain future feels utterly leaden. Maybe it's overexposure to more literate indie rock acts that try a little harder, or the more recent brand of emo that tries to imbue their wistful contemplation with a sense of urgency. But for as lightly pleasant as Real Estate is, even with the integration of more synthetic drum machines and a bit of strings, or maybe even a smattering of a yacht rock, there's nothing that pulls me back to this. Now, I say all this with the qualification that this band has always been in the nap fodder side of indie rock, and thus I can't get all that mad at an act that's certainly going to soundtrack middle-aged, presumably progressive white people slumped on their couch midway through a bottle of wine. Most of us will get there, and while I'm fairly certain a part of me will wind up there, I ain't there yet. 5 out of 10. Move on. Next up from Body Count, Carnivore. Okay, let's keep this real. The question is less whether or not this album is any good, and more, was Body Count ever any good? For those of you who aren't aware, this was a thrash metal hip-hop side project by Ice-T, where he doesn't really rap that much, instead delivering hyperbolic and ultra-violent stories with the belief that as a parody, they would both speak truth to power, but also inspire black kids to stay away from that sort of life. Now, the problem with this sort of parody is that hip-hop rapidly hit this level of excess anyway, and Ice-T was really ham-fisted with his messaging. This sort of project and genre fusion required tact that he didn't really have, so previous Body Count albums have not only aged really badly, but could also default to glorification as much as it was sending a message. Couple that with just better rap metal that's been released throughout the decades, and Carnivore feels like a real struggle to catch up. Now, that's not terrible. It doesn't sound as shoddily produced as previous Body Count albums, and Ice-T has always been a powerful frontman, and if you can break free of the cognitive dissonance of long-running Law & Order SVU star Ice-T rapping about police violence, lyrically, the album feels a little more grounded until we default back to the same hyper-masculine, violent posturing. And this feels all the more jarring opposite the 2 tribute songs, one being a middling cover of Ace of Spades, and the other a tribute to the late Nipsey Hussle, featuring Amy Lee of Evanescence, and it's as tonally weird as you would expect. And the frustrating thing is that even if you're accepting this on the most basic level and concept, it's just not even very good metal. The grooves are sloppily defined in the bass, the riffing gets tedious, there's barely any attempt at atmosphere, more than a few songs are lacking momentum, and for as developed as some of the drum lines can be, they don't often synchronize all that well with the rhythm section, which leads to some really messy solos. But overall, let's be real, this has always been a novelty side project of which I'm not sure you could have ever taken that seriously, and in 2020, there's not much worth discussing. 4 out of 10. I'd move on. Next up, from Spectral Lore and Mare Cognitum, Wanderers, Astrology of the Nine. Okay, this is a lot. 2 one-man black metal projects, one from Greece and one from the United States. They put out a collab album called Soul in 2013 that showed off a ton of potential, even if it seemed to defer a little more to Spectral Lore's more wild and dissonant experimentation than Mare Cognitum's sharper focus on melody and song structure. But collaboration that showed a lot of promise, so when we got a full 10 songs that nearly run 2 hours exploring the entire solar system, well, there was a part of me that thought back to that Sufjan Stevens Planetarium collaboration projects a couple years back, but this is not quite that, with both men taking alternating individual songs before closing in for a few collab joints. And that'd be fine enough if I didn't feel like Mare Cognitum didn't consistently deliver more striking and potent melodies, especially in the guitar leads, pretty much all the way through. Whereas while Spectral Lore has interesting moments of experimentation, like on the warmer progressive guitar section on Earth, or the heavy bass driving a lot of the progressions on Uranus, and what has to be his choice to add more icy electronics to part 2 of Pluto, his moments of indulgence leads to songs that run long on a project that already feels bloated, even for its cosmic scope, especially in how they fade out. Again, the biggest problem with this is the length, and while I'd argue there is enough variance in the shredding, atmosphere, howling, and guttural vocals, and some insanely pummeling drum work that it stays engaging longer than I expected, certain passages, they really do wear out their welcome. Now, thankfully, if you're gonna have an album this long, exploring the tempestuous parallels between the Greco-Roman pantheon and their planetary counterparts, often in some vividly graphic detail, this is probably the way to do it, especially when you can make out the lyrics. They are pretty interesting in terms of some poetic flair, especially in the searing beauty of Venus and the tempestuous slow giant of Jupiter. But as a whole, while I can respect a behemoth of this size, I only really love it in patches. Definitely a potent and ambitious project that is worth hearing, but in comparison with other black metal that I've heard this year, I know I'm only going to go back to this in some isolated moments. So, strong 7 out of 10. If you're curious, it's worth hearing. Next up from Gotthard, 13. You know, for me at least, Gotthard is the perfect act to cover on a show like this. A Swiss hard rock act that's been cranking out subtle stylistic variations of a vintage hard rock sound for decades now. And they don't really give me a ton to say unless they go above and beyond, which they did reasonably consistently in the 2000s and with 2014's criminally overlooked Bang. Now, I wasn't wild about their 2017 album Silver, but coming back with 13, well, the struggle becomes how to sell this to anyone where the advice isn't just to go check out Open or Home Run or Lip Service or Domino Effect, because once again, we got a mid-tier Gotthard album that seems to be struggling to differentiate itself or sound unique. Yes, Nick Mader is delivering better vocals. Shame the drum and bass mixing is really inconsistent, especially around the cymbals, and that's not counting the moments where they try to get rougher and more lo-fi like Dial Hard, but that's also never been a great sound for Gotthard, a very 90s update to a very 80s formula, especially when they lock into more of a bluesier vibe with more developed bass and better guitar solos and overall stronger songs. It's certainly better than that Indian-inspired experience on Mysteria, or that attempt at more of a heavy breakdown on Rescue Me to close out the album, that's for damn sure. But even with that, none of it's all that unfamiliar, and it's not a good sign when probably the most distinctive moment on the album is a really middling cover of ABBA's SOS. All the more distracting because Gotthard already has an original song with that name from 2012. And honestly, ABBA's version's better. And given that the writing for this band has never been really more than basic hard rock platitudes, outside of a baffling marriage ballad called Marry You that just becomes pure cheese, I'm stuck with the songs that really just have the best hooks, and there's just not that many of them. Man on a Mission, Better Than Love, Every Time I Die. The rest just feels Gotthard meat and potatoes, and this many albums into their career just doesn't give me a lot to say or work with. Strong 6 out of 10. If you're a fan, you might enjoy it, but you've heard better. Just saying. Next up, from Code Orange, Underneath. So, remember remember a few weeks back when I covered Loathe and said that I don't have the deepest level of familiarity with metalcore? Well, going into Code Orange reminded me of just how close the genre could fall into outright howling nightmare fuel, leaping into the conversation in a big way with Forever in early 2017. Now, granted, some of that was inevitable when you get Kurt Ballou of Converge to produce it, but what made Forever so viscerally potent, even as somebody who doesn't really love this genre and knew of some of the demolition of corporate mainstream rock, was kind of out the window given they signed a Roadrunner, but they were just uncompromising and visceral enough to make you think it was believable or possible. Yeah, some of it was just hyper aggro posturing, but when it was just catchy enough to stick, because they could write good melodies, it showed a lot of promise, especially with the commitment to some real creeping dread and some of the jagged atmosphere. So obviously the next thing to do is to replace Kurt Ballou with Nick Raskulinecz, who was responsible for some of the most flatly produced and underwhelming mainstream rock and metal of the past decade. And I hate to be the one to say it, but losing some of that suffocating atmosphere and thicker low end does hurt Code Orange here. The guitars are flatter, the oily industrial and power electronics textures they hit more bluntly can honestly sound a little bit dated, especially if you remember the late 90s, and the jagged blasts of squealing noise and clanking percussion amid some of the breakdowns, they're slowly becoming more of a crutch of uniqueness for a band getting subsumed into more radio-friendly metalcore, which is kind of a shame, because that's the sort of metalcore that's never really been my thing. And look, I get that Code Orange, they've never been subtle per se, but it reminds me a lot of the shift to beefier, blunter tactics that characterized Nine Inch Nails shifting from the downward spiral to the fragile, and it just does not cut as deeply for me, even if this approach does give their melodies a little bit more space to breathe, which is a good touch. Some of the cleaner songs are actually pretty solid. And yet, I'll be blunt, the songwriting doesn't really save them much here either. I do appreciate a band not really trying to make the anti-social media album, but rather one that shows how social media has revealed what's been lurking beneath us all along, which builds on a lot of themes for Forever and makes some potent points surrounding online shaming and stalking. But there are also definitely moments where a reactionary angle seems to slide in with lines like "the tabula rasa has been harmed," and the hyper-aggressive posturing starts to become a little bit harder to take seriously, especially with the continuous broadsides that are being leveled at the industry when the band is now compromising to that industry. But as it is, again, not my genre, take everything I say with a grain of salt, but this feels like a compromise for a band that's trying to do everything but compromise, and at least to a good but kind of jarring listen. Strong 6 out of 10, but again, this genre's not my thing. Take it with a grain of salt. Next up from Caitlyn Smith, Supernova. Man, this is a project I needed this week. A very welcome follow-up to Caitlyn Smith's star-making pop country debut Starfire that was among the best albums of 2018. Although there were some concerns driven by expanding the production team and seemingly sliding towards the more atmospheric, reverb-driven indie Americana sound that's been adjacent to Dream Country but kinda got a little played out around 5 or 6 years ago, and thus the easy comparison for me to make here maybe becomes Florence and the Machine, but with a twangier, more soulful bent. And you know what? I gotta give a lot of credit. It has to go to Caitlyn Smith for refining a lot of her vocal delivery and technique. Starfire had moments where her delivery could feel a little unpolished, and even as the instrumentals develop more soul and smolder here in the guitars and bass, she meets them in the middle and remains one of the most striking voices in country right now. If you want to go to this album for anything, it's her. That being said, while I think this project is great in its own right, and the closing track Lonely Together is goddamn devastating, I would struggle to say this project is as good as Starfire, and it comes down to two factors. The first comes in the production. The switch to Christian Langdon isn't bad per se, but you can tell certain instrumentals aren't quite as refined or lush or diverse, and there are moments where the mix feels a little bit blown out in comparison with the cuts produced by Paul Moa. The larger problem, though, I would attribute to the writing. Namely, the songs fall into two categories: love songs that fall hard and break apart harder, and the smoldering, I just can't get over you, I want to move on songs that tend to be a little more interesting. But if you're looking for the more diverse storytelling and emotional complexity that characterize Starfire's deeper cuts and most potent moments that wound up among my favorite songs of 2018, you're not really getting them as consistently. Now still, I would argue this is a pretty great project, and it absolutely works for the current time, so let me just say that. Late 8 out of 10, check it out, it's worth hearing. Next up, from Niall Horan, Heartbreak Weather.
You don't break them, but it hurts so bad the way you bend the rules.
So I want to say right now that Flicker was the sort of project that really caught me off guard in 2017. I had zero expectations that it'd be good at all, let alone a great solo pop debut that put Niall head and shoulders among not just One Direction, but the majority of mainstream pop. Yes, the influences and especially the Fleetwood Mac worship were obvious and blatant, but Mare did some really strong songs underneath, and the project has held up for me. And thus going for a more expanded sound in his sophomore album, I had expectations this time around, especially with Nice to Meet Ya being the underappreciated powerhouse that it was, and Heartbreak Weather is just as good as Flicker, if not better. For one, it's a more varied and explicitly modern project. The rock-solid compositions, they could get a little bit sleepy on the back half of Flicker, and the balance in terms of tone and tempo across this album is way more consistent, spacing out the ballads with the more upbeat or anthemic moments, especially with those coursing bass grooves that balance out some of the heavier percussion. And while you can tell there are glances at Ed Sheeran and Shawn Mendes's templates in the production and cadence courtesy of the Teddy Geiger and Tobias Jesso Jr. co-writes, maybe even a little bit of the 1975 as well as circa 2016, Niall, he'll actually get a little bit rougher and louder than all of them, which can have some mixed results with some blown out mixing around the vocals, but it's a minor gripe, especially when his hooks will place him in a different ballpark. But what elevates Niall further is something that's very different in modern pop these days, especially from male artists: emotional honesty that still feels grounded in mature confidence. I mean, that swagger can feel kind of old-fashioned, but when you consider how many of these songs circle around the uncertain, questioning moments beginning a relationship, either starting fresh or more commonly from an ex where there's still some messy feelings, there is modern framing and context, and it's really refreshing. And while you would think 14 songs of this would start to get a bit repetitive, Niall is surprisingly solid at keeping the emotional through line consistent but varied. From the nervous butterflies that comes with something new and exciting, to the sweeping moments of pure ego that he can actually sell. Although it really locks in when we get the conflicted frustration trying to move on, and yet by the end of the album, the big swing to try to recover that old relationship that even he knows won't work, and inevitably pushes him back on the road again to keep on trying. So it winds up being a bit of a tempestuous album, but it's a great pop rock album all the same. No sophomore slump here, strong 8 out of 10. You guys are gonna discount this? Don't. Check this out. And finally, from Electronica, a written testimony.
Tall, dark, and decked out in customary regalia, smelling like paraphernalia, hailing from the home of Mahalia.
I feel it is very important for me to say this right out of the gate. Even if I had bought into the hype, there was no way in hell that a Electronica album could have ever matched expectations. It's kind of like Tool and Fear Inoculum, except Tool actually had significant bodies of work, whereas Electronica has had scattered singles and a few EPs, all of which showed tremendous promise that has allowed fans to keep the hope alive and his name in the conversation for over a decade. But now that we've finally got a full-length album, seemingly muscled into shape by Jay-Z choraling a wayward artist who sounds like he'd rather be doing anything else, does it really match any of the hype? Or even rise to the standards of the best cuts that Electronica's actually put out? No. I'll be blunt. This is mediocre. It's coasting on ego and hype and presumptions of genius that get very thin very fast. And any attempt to be self-aware about it is revealing the worst possible arrogance from both Jays here. Yes, Electronica, part of releasing art to the public means you get criticized for it. And it leaves me instantly suspicious when the album switches to increasingly hollow bragging or Nation of Islam inside jargon, often not in English, which feels very much intended to keep up the aura and mystique which the content, once you translate it, doesn't really support, especially when it comes with a healthy dose of anti-Semitism and pro-Michael Jackson conspiracy theories. I mean, it's not surprising that Jay-Z fares better, although I'm not sure he could have picked a worse time to double down on the uber-capitalist side of his persona and intending to continue to make excuses surrounding his behavior with the NFL, but then we gotta get to the music and the execution. And there's so many baffling missteps here, it's hard to know where even to start. Why is the vocal mixing of two rap icons so shoddy from song to song? And why'd they include a single released in 2010 with a timbre and structure that barely fits? And on the topic of not fitting in at all, why is Travis Scott here at all doing a James Blake impression? Especially when you're gonna get James Blake himself on the project later on? And what's frustrating is that going more lo-fi here doesn't sound that much experimental or weird, especially if you listen to a lot of underground hip-hop where this barely scratches the surface, but it doesn't match with the content. When Jay-Z had no ID for 444, the rougher, sample-driven backdrop, it made sense for a more introspective and personal project. Here, the production doesn't match the opulence of the flexing nor the mystique that it's trying to cultivate. And with so many crowd cheers that are peppered in, where a lot of the beats that are left running with plenty of space for more verses, it just feels really self-congratulatory and not earned. And when you factor in how they import a hook from 2010 to actually have a good hook, and how a lot of the percussion and samples feel really shoddily mixed, and how the project has no sense of momentum or any songs that come close to Exhibit A or Exhibit C, you know, I think back to Dr. Dre's Compton album from 2015, and how many people were just so unsatisfied with it, or just outright dismissed and forgot about it because it could never match the expectations from Detox. But I still love that album because it expanded the focus and had such a lush, vibrant world that stacked up the great verses and performances where even if you could obviously tell who was writing for Dre, it was at least trying so much harder than this in the content. People seemed to care. This, I'm sorry, it's not even close. Even if I do think that hazy moment of melancholy at the end, kind of well executed, but that doesn't save it. Light 5 out of 10. Yeah, even as someone with no expectations, I was disappointed with this. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can't imagine that I said some things very controversial in this review. Comments are right down there. Have fun. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys want to get involved and help supporting my schedule, the link to my Patreon is right over here. Keep in mind, we're all in emergency quarantine situations, so if you need the extra cash, don't feel hassled by it. Like, I'll still be cranking out these once a week as it is, but if you guys want to have insight, link's right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.